Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Book Club of California's online and in-person program titled Background Artist, The Life and Work of Tyrus Wong. My name is Kevin Kosick, and I'm the Executive Director for the Book Club of California, and it's my pleasure to welcome you all here and host the program this evening. For those of you that might be new to the Book Club of California, we are a nonprofit, member and donor-supported organization that is dedicated to preserving and promoting the history of the book and the book arts. Oftentimes, we do that with a focus on the history and the literature of California and the West. The book club publishes limited edition, finely made books. We have a scholarly journal called the Quarterly Newsletter, and we have keepsakes for our members. We host a year-round series of exhibitions and programs like the one this evening on topics including fine printing, design, typography, bookbinding, collecting, the book trade, California history, and much, much more. Now, if you're not a member of the book club, or if your membership has lapsed and you're interested in what we do, please consider joining our century-long tradition. Our membership dues are modest, the benefits are many, and we simply can't do the work of the book club without the support of our members. So I encourage you to go online to bccbooks.org to find out more about the book club, to join, or to donate. And now, tonight's program, as I said, is titled Background Artist, The Life and Work of Tyrus Wong. Our speaker is Karen Fang. Karen is a film scholar and cultural critic who writes about the intersection of Eastern and Western aesthetics in global culture. Her books and publication span 19th century British writing about exotic objects to 20th and 21st century Hong Kong film. And they explore how moments of modernization excite visual and narrative art. At the University of Houston, she is the professor, or is a professor, not the only professor, in the Department of English. And she is also a founder and chair of a college-level initiative in media and the moving image. As reflected by her work with those cultural institutions like the Museum of Fine Arts Houston and Poland's Five Flavors Film Festival, which sounds so interesting. She's a firm believer in art's capacity to enrich civic life. I love this part about your intro. A mother, child of immigrants, and Sunday painter, Karen is especially honored to be the author of a new biography about Bambi artist and Disney legend Tyrus Wong. And tonight, that is what Karen will be talking about. Her book, Background Artist, The Life and Work of Tyrus Wong. Now, if you're like me, you may not know the name Tyrus Wong, but you probably know some of the images he created, including scenes from the beloved Disney classic Bambi. Yet, when he came to this country as a child, Tyrus was an illegal immigrant locked up in an offshore detention center. The book, Background Artist, shares the inspiring story of Tyrus Wong's remarkable 106-year life and showcases his wide array of creative work, from the paintings and the fine art prints he made working for Roosevelt's Works Progress Administration to the unique handmade kites he designed and flew on the Santa Monica beach. This book and the talk tonight celebrates a multi-talented Asian American artist and pioneer. Now, if you have questions for our speaker, please wait till the end of the presentation. We certainly will have time for a Q&A, and we'll take questions from you here in the club rooms. And if you're joining us on Zoom, you can use the chat and the Q&A function to ask your questions or make your comments, and I'll curate the questions from the virtual audience from both the chat and the Q&A when I come back at the end of the presentation. So now it's my great pleasure to introduce our speaker, Karen Fang.
Thank you so much for being here. Imagine you're a child, just 9 or 10 years old. alone in a foreign country where you don't speak the language. You've been separated from your parent and you're the only child there. You don't know how long you'll have to stay there or whether, when you're freed, you'll get to see your parent again. This was the experience of Tyrus Wong, a Chinese immigrant who came to the US as a child in 1920 and who went on to do many things. He's best known for helping make Bambi. He also worked in many other media and art forms, and as was mentioned, he lived to 106. And this is how I start almost all of my talks. And then this is where I usually break off into the whichever sort of focus of interest I think best suits the audience. When somebody lives to 106 and does all these different things, it's hard to fit it into a 45-minute talk, sometimes a 30-minute or a 20-minute talk. So if it's a film audience, we talk mostly about Bambi and animation. You know, I've been doing a lot of talks at Chinese and Asian American museums and organizations. So we talk a lot about Angel Island and Chinese exclusion. Does everyone know about Chinese exclusion? I know you all are familiar with Angel Island, but a lot of times people don't know about Chinese exclusion. You here in San Francisco, because of Angel Island, you all know about the federal policy that prohibited Chinese from becoming naturalized and all of these restrictions that were placed on them for more than 60 years. Okay, but for the Book Club of California, knowing that you all are California-based book lovers and with a special interest in California books, I wanted to get into Tyrus's story through a particular way. Tyrus's story, as you'll see, is a profoundly California story in which meaningful both to audiences here in San Francisco and also our online audiences in LA. But it's also a story that can be experienced by a couple of unique books. Unique and interesting. Does anyone recognize this cover? No? This is the cover of El Dorado, a hand-printed art book about the history of California. I only know of 3 copies of this book, and they're all in Los Angeles. It was made in 1928 by students at the Otis Art Institute, which is one of many art schools that opened in the Southern California area between 1910 and 1930. About 18 art schools opened during that period. So you can see there's a photo of the Otis Art Institute. It was the mansion of Harrison Gray Otis, the publisher of the LA Times. He donated it to the city of Los Angeles to become an art school. And so you can see here in the cover, the stylized image of the bivouac. The bivouac was the name of the building that Harrison Otis, and that palm tree, you know, that gets memorialized in the cover. You can see it there in the photo. That palm tree sort of is iconic for Otis students. It figures in all of their images and their stories and their memories about Otis. So the book El Dorado was made at Otis in 1928, which is the year that Tyrus started at Otis as a teenage scholarship student. So you can see Tyrus here in the middle. There among all of his friends. He was a lot young. He was a little bit younger than most of his peers there. He was there, you know, as I said, he was there on scholarship, but he very quickly becomes recognized among all of his peers and fellow students as being a very interesting and unusually talented artist. And when he graduates, the sort of the signatures that everybody writes in his graduation book are all of these things about, like, I learned so much from you. Thank you for so much. I expect the best of you. All things like that. So El Dorado itself, the book is a verse narrative about the history of California. So one Otis art student, Helen Hatch, wrote this long narrative poem about Otis, and it tells, or about California, and it tells the history of California through the successive populations who inhabit the land, the territory. So this is the opening pages. So it's in telling the successive populations of California, there's the natives with who greet the arriving missionaries. And then these are just some of the pages. Then it's called Conquest by the Gringos. The Spanish and other white Europeans, other Anglos, who then move out the missionaries and consolidate the land. And then the arrival of the 49ers over there. You can see the I forget what it's called, like those covered wagons. Come to college, I guess, thank you, wagons. So each different students at Otis contributed their designs to match the narrative, right? And so you can see these wonderful examples of the different visions and the sort of styles of the different artists. Many of the artists who were contributing these images include names that are now well known to art and film history. So this is by John Hench. Alex, anyone else know who John Hench is? John Hench? John Hench was a #2 employee of Disney Studios. So he was known as Mickey Mouse's official portrait artist. So he's the one who standardizes the style. He's the one who standardizes the image of Mickey Mouse. And then he's also the one who stylizes Walt Disney's signature. So the signature that we all recognize, right, was a stylized version of his actual signature. And those were all pioneered or engineered by John Hench. This is by Charles Morimoto. Charles Morimoto was a Japanese American abstract painter who, upon leaving Otis, he's immediately recognized as sort of one of the local pioneers of modernism, of abstract modernism. Unfortunately, almost all of his art career was subsequently lost due to internment. So he's never been accorded the sort of recognition that he seemed to be on the cusp of gaining. That one, the 49ers, is by Preston Blair. Anyone familiar with that name? Alex, do you want to say?
Oh, he's just a very famous animator.
Yeah, another important animator at Disney. Preston's brother was Lee Blair, who was a very important watercolorist in the California watercolor movement. And Lee was married to Mary Blair, who was one of the important concept artists at Disney and contemporary of Tyrus when they're at Disney. Okay, so I have multiple reasons for starting this conversation or this presentation with this book. It's beautiful, it's rare. I knew you guys would appreciate it. It's also clearly about California. But for Tyrus's story, I'm interested in El Dorado because it embodies America's complicated relationship with ethnic Asians. That history of coming in through Angel Island and living in the US under Chinese exclusion that Tyrus had to endure. Okay, El Dorado was, as a project of these art students at Otis, it was created under the leadership of Benji Okubo. Benji was a Nisei, meaning he's second-generation Japanese. His parents were immigrants and he and his siblings were born in the US. They grew up in Riverside. The father was a gardener, like many Japanese at the time. His mother, the matriarch of the Okubo family in Riverside, was a graduate of the Tokyo Art Institute and was a noted calligrapher and brush painter. So the family grew up, with a lot of arts in the household. His sister, Mine, anybody know Mine Okubo? Right, she wrote Citizen 13660, the graphic book about internment. She was a very important artist. She did mosaics at Fort Ord, right? And she was a scholar. She had won one of the most prestigious scholarships at Berkeley right before internment as well. But Benji, as you can see here, was your sort of classic charismatic art student. He wore his hair long. He would later on, people who met him later on described him as being like a buccaneer or as a pirate, like this really just sort of charismatic individual. He was known as an artist for having an idealist utopian vision. He loved color. After he graduated Otis, before the war starts, he was a very important figure at the Los Angeles Art Students League. And so he works in this kind of what was called this sort of synchrony pattern, kind of this Fauvist style of incredibly bright colors, almost sort of unreal, sort of dispensing with realism, right? To give the sort of dreamlike, oniric quality. So he's just a sort of visionary leader. It's really Benji who oversees El Dorado. You've got to have a director at any kind of project like that. Benji's the one who sort of like says, let's do it. He assigns, all of the pictures, right? He puts it together. It's his image on the cover, that color print of the bivouac on the cover, that's his. Okay. But El Dorado, wonderful as it is as a book, is a telling instance of the ambiguous place of ethnic Asians in American and California history. Because despite Benji's leadership, despite the many other Japanese American artists who also contribute images to El Dorado, despite the fact that El Dorado tells the history of California through the successive populations that have inhabited the California land, there's no mention of ethnic Asians. So the Japanese who are gardening the lands, the Chinese who build the railroads and are doing the laundries and running the stores, completely unrepresented in that history. So what does that tell you about sort of these books like that and our relationship to the ways in which they document American history and American heritage, right? Visual objects, I don't need to tell you guys, right? Like they're beautiful things, but they're also artifacts of history, right? They preserve history many times in narrative through the words, but they also preserve history through their pictures and through the fact of their production as well, right? So American racial history, so often we think of it gets reduced to sort of black-white relations, right? And so everybody knows this, you go to school in America, the history of that American prosperity was built on slavery. We get these words like anti-blackness that sort of enter into popular discourse. But I would say outside of California and really outside of San Francisco, where you all have Angel Island, just on your doorstep, Chinese exclusion, even internment, right, often isn't taught in schools. And so Asian American history so often is one where we're characterized as the perpetual foreigners, right? So, and that's instrumentalized into a legal and cultural and social history, right? So in the case of Chinese exclusion, they can't become citizens. In the case of internment, when Japanese, like the Okubos, get sent to the camps. So this history is known to various degrees, but El Dorado shows how it's also present, it's tangible, it's visible, right? And through our material objects and in beautiful art objects, like a beautiful book like El Dorado. Which brings us, so this just shows you those highlights there. It's from the table of contents. The highlights are the other Japanese American artists who are represented in there. So that's 5 images in 30 contributions. So that's a higher percentage than actual ethnic Asians in California at that time. And yet, they're not allowed to represent, they're not given the opportunity to represent themselves in that history. So that brings us to another book, Composition. This book is very well known. Is anyone familiar with this book? Composition by Arthur Wesley Dow.
Familiar with the teacher, Arthur Wesley Dow.
And what do you know about Arthur, about Dow?
He was also a famous artist.
Yeah.
Yeah, there have been books, and he's influenced by Asian art. I guess primarily Japanese, if I remember correctly.
Yeah, excellent. So Arthur Wesley Dow was a landscape painter from New England. He was very well known. He's more famous actually as a painting instructor than he was as an artist himself. Most importantly, he was Georgia O'Keeffe's teacher. And he was the author of perhaps the most widely used art textbook at the time. So Composition comes out in 1899. This is the edition from 1920. So it's, for 20 years, this is dominant textbook. This is almost certainly a textbook that Tyrus would have seen when he was in art school. Okay. And then as the gentleman points out, Composition is particularly interesting because Dow, who was a close friend of Ernest Fenollosa, an Orientalist, Dow was very much influenced by Oriental aesthetics, Asian aesthetics, Japanese and Chinese brush painting, those sort of flat compositions, right? So, there's composition is filled with pages that look like this, with long prose descriptions talking about the history, the logic, the philosophy behind Oriental brush painting, right? Diagrams of composition, like demonstrations of how like brush strokes and lines work, right? And so because Tao is essentially sort of his evangelizing Oriental aesthetics, right, as a model for fine arts. And this is interesting because obviously it's a notable break from the European tradition, right? When we in the West, if you think about the fine arts, we tend to think about Renaissance painting or something like that. And all of a sudden in 1899, Arthur Dow publishes this really influential book, and so it marks this break from the European tradition. It's clearly a step towards modernism, towards abstraction, a aesthetic trend in which America is going to be really important, right? And then more importantly for all of us here in California, it's a shift. It's also a shift from the East Coast to the West Coast, right? Because whereas Oriental aesthetics coming into the US, right? It's coming in often, it's literally coming in, on the ships that are bringing in the scrolls and the porcelain and the woodblock prints, right? It's also being practiced, right, by people like Benji Okubo, who's grown up with his mother, who had trained at the Tokyo Art Institute. So the Tao's influence in American culture, right, is hugely significant. It's really empowering, in particular for California art culture and California art critics, because suddenly this becomes a way to sort of legitimize or to elevate art culture in California. California is, very new, right? And, up until then, art culture seems to be taking place in New York because New York is closer to London and Paris. And now suddenly you have somebody based in New York saying, actually, what's really interesting is coming over across the Pacific. Right. But you think about what did this look like to Benji Okubo or to Tyrus when they're sitting there at Otis, right? On the one hand, they're a legally, socially prescribed population. On the other hand, they embody a highly valued artistic cultural legacy. And so, this is a photo I showed you earlier of what was actually going on in Angel Island, right? Family separation, right? The kids are being, everybody's being scrutinized for their anatomical distinctions, right? That are going into their immigration files so that they can make sure that, you really are who you say you are. And every time you come back and forth across, they can try to identify you, right? And on the other hand, over here, this is a program from the Oriental Artist Group of California. The Oriental Artist Group of California was a group of California artists, all ethnic Chinese or Japanese, both in San Francisco and in Los Angeles, who during the 1930s, from 1934 through the middle of the 1930s, they decided to organize their own group exhibitions. So, as you know, it's very difficult as an artist to get exhibitions. It's very difficult to be a fine artist. They're doing it during the Depression, right? So they're trying to launch a fine arts career during the Depression. And then they're also non-white, non-citizens, right? Most of them are non-citizens, right? And yet they're actually able to do it. And one of the reasons they're able to do it is because they organized their own group exhibitions. And in fact, if you go back and you look at the art history, the art criticism during the time in the San Francisco Chronicle and the LA Times, these exhibits are often described as being the most interesting of the season. So coming back to Tyrus, this is exactly why Tyrus and his art is so revolutionary and so visionary. So just to recap the sort of his contribution to Bambi, Tyrus was already an accomplished fine artist when during the Depression, he's a newly married, he's a baby on his way. He just thinks, I need a steady paycheck. So he takes an entry-level job at Disney. And Disney at that time is trying to make Bambi, and it's just turning out to be way more complicated than anybody anticipates. And Tyrus thinks that he's got a lot of higher placed friends at Otis because he'd gone to art school with all of these artists, and he thinks like, I think I know what their problem is. I think I have a solution. And what he figures out is that for Bambi, you need to be able to see the animals. So this kind of like fussy, like Arthur Rackham kind of like really elaborate, detailed, ornate kind of drawing that had happened in Snow White, the film that, was their Disney Studios breakthrough film, is just not going to work for Bambi. And so he does some sort of sample boards, and it's shown to Walt, and Walt immediately says, this is what we need to do. We'll follow this guy's style. And so essentially what Tyrus does is, what he does is he uses his fine art style, what he'd already been doing as a accomplished fine artist, which is, somebody had had a European art school type training at Otis, but also always valued his own Chinese heritage. And so he sort of sneaks into Bambi, right? The solution for Bambi is what we can all see now is essentially Oriental brushwork, right? But for Disney, for Walt, it's a solution to a technical problem. But what we recognize now, it's culture that allows him to do that, cultural difference that becomes that technological innovation. So if that were the only thing Tyrus did, that in itself would be a significant contribution, right? And Bambi remains, right, this universally recognized film. It's still Disney's one of its most re-released films, right? I mean, that's hugely significant. But he, as we said, did so many other things. Prior to Disney, he was a rising young fine artist. So Kevin mentioned his work for the WPA. So in the very early 30s, even before the WPA, he's known for these really strong figure paintings. You can see the sort of the brushwork, right? Strong contour lines with these incredibly sort of Michelangelo muscled figures. That's one of his first reviews in the LA Times. He's just covered over and over and over again in the LA Times. Some of you may know this painting, now widely known as Chinese Jesus. It was made in 1936. This is before Disney, before the WPA. It was commissioned by a Chinese church in Los Angeles. So it shows how, how rich and assimilated these communities already are in the 1930s, right? That you can be ethnic Chinese, you can be Christian, you can be recognizing the power of art to self-represent it. They're going to commission an artist to make this painting. It's it's a hugely ambitious painting. It's over 6 feet tall. So, religious painting, a figure painting, a Christ portrait, a very big painting. This is all sort of conventional indices of high art aspiration, right? Of ambition. It's, as you can see, and you can hear from the name, right? It's a fascinatingly fusion or bicultural product, right? I mean, it's clearly supposed to be Christ. He has a halo, right? He has his beard and red hair, but he also has kind of almond eyes, right? He's floating in the clouds, right? He has his hand held out in supplication, but that cloud looks much more like the stylized clouds that you would see in Chinese opera painting than you would see in traditional, like European style religious portraiture, right? David over here, he's a longtime collector of Chinese opera backdrops, right? Will tell you this looks a lot like Buddha, right? Not like Christ. So it's a painting whose significance is still being understood today. And of course, some of you will know that it has a very specific San Francisco history, right? Because the painting was lost for decades, and then it was rediscovered in the Chinese United Church over on Stockton in Washington, right before Tyrus passed. After Disney, he goes to work at Warner Brothers. He's at Warner Brothers for nearly 30 years as a motion picture sketch artist. So doing concept art similar to like when he was at Disney, also doing prop paintings or prop art. While he's at the movie studios, he works in other print, commercial, fine, and decorative arts. So our Los Angeles audiences who are listening, I'm sure they all recognize the logo for Phoenix Bakery, a very beloved and still operating bakery today in Chinatown. And throughout these years, from the 50s through the 1970s, which is widely known as the golden age of greeting cards, Tyrus is also one of the nation's most recognized greeting card artists. And to me, this is what was always most fascinating, was that that Americans were going in droves to buy these distinctly Chinese styled Christmas cards, right? Where you have the Christ child, like Chinese Jesus previously, like, painted out, sketched out with these distinctly sort of Chinese style brush strokes. So this is the genius of Tyrus's signature bicultural style. From the Bambi history, his technical innovation, you have to also recognize, was also a personal and cultural triumph, right? It allows, at a time when Chinese are being marginalized, he's sneaking in Chinese art into, at this time, like, the hottest Hollywood company at the time, right? So Tyrus is shaping our most iconic film, one of our most iconic films. He's literally, his artistic vision is possible for, our, infinite number of screen memories, right, from our childhood, right? He does that with his intentionally fusion style. So he makes cultural difference central to our collective national culture, right? And then of course, it's not just in Bambi, it's in so many other visual sites, right? It's ubiquitous throughout so many other media and art forms beyond Bambi. So I'm so gratified to be speaking to you at this time in California, because this is a California story. As I said, he comes to the US as a 10-year-old child, and then the next 96 years of his life are in California. So he lives in California as the former immigrant, lives in California longer than most people live, right? It's a profoundly California story. Tyrus's story also follows another recent Book Club of California events. Kevin mentioned Sonora Bab. I think, wasn't there also talk about Anna May Wong? It was here. So Tyrus was friends with both of them. He was very close with Sonora Bab and Anna May Wong. So they're all part of this circle of like collective, the coterie of creatives during the 1930s. And they're both recurring figures in my book as characters. But I'm also happy to be speaking to you right now because Thursday, May 1st, this coming Thursday, is the start of Asian American History Month. And also right now, this is also a sort of peak moment in Asian American art history. I was thrilled this morning to go see the Ruth Asawa exhibit, just a few blocks away. If you haven't gone yet, you really should go. It's just sensational and beautiful. Right now in Washington, D.C., there's a big exhibit of paintings by interned Japanese American artists. So Asawa is best known as a sculptor, right? There's 3 female painters who were all interned, who had, like I said with Benji, were practicing artists before internment. And fortunately, they were able to hold on to some of their paintings, to save some of their paintings. And so that's why we're able to see them at the Smithsonian. And so, it's an important time to recognize our history and to experience it through these beautiful artifacts. So if you're a believer like me, following Mike Davis, the great California writer and LA writer, Mike Davis, that California is always on the front lines of national culture and history. This is especially true of art history too, that American art history, at least since 1899 with composition, is one where California is leading the way. Then Tyrus is a key figure in that history as well, right? So I want to wind up with like 2 more important books. Over here on the left, we have With New Eyes from 1995, which is a cover. This is a catalog for an exhibit that was actually at San Francisco State in 1995. And it was one of the first major exhibitions of Asian American art. It has a foreword by Maxine Hong Kingston. And this is a revelation at the time that it happens, because nobody had really thought that, nobody recognized, right? Because like I said earlier, the consequences of internment was that all of these Japanese American artists who had had these productive careers, they were just disrupted, right? And a lot of times, like, they were sort of having to find them, from people's basements and things like that. So that was a really significant early exhibit. And then over here on the right is Asian American art from 2008 with Gordon Chang, Mark Johnson, who had also been one of the curators behind this exhibit, and Paul Karlstrom of the Smithsonian. Gordon Chang, you may know, is a historian at Stanford. So he's best known as one of the leading historians of Chinese American history. But he's also the son of Chang Shu-chi, who was a really important immigrant artist who came from China, who came to the US during the war. And you may have heard of the 100 Doves painting that he did for Roosevelt in the war. So, and this is a very big book. So With New Eyes, that's a catalog, like this first early catalog. It's like this soft cover catalog. It's about this thick. It's this big, and there's hardly any in existence. And the people who have them don't want to share it. Like, I've only seen this through a digital copy that, like, I had to use my scholarly credentials to get somebody to send me. Okay, this book weighs like probably it's like this big. It weighs about 15 pounds. It's gorgeously illustrated, glossy paper, right? So the transition in these 20-some years between these two books tells you how we got to this moment. Like I'm saying, this wonderful moment when we're starting to recognize the importance, the richness of Asian American art history and the importance of Asian American art history in American art history. So Tyrus is a central figure throughout those histories, throughout both of those books, even though he actually wasn't in the 1995 exhibit, because the 1995 exhibit mostly focused on fine art. And so at the time, they'd even sort of forgotten about his early work as a fine artist. They knew him mostly as a commercial artist. And then also it was at San Francisco State, so it was leaned a little heavier on the Northern California artists. But all of those people that are in that 95 catalog, 95 exhibit, like those were all his peers and contemporaries, right? And then by the time you get to the 2008 catalog, which has this elaborate cross-referencing, you can see that there's nobody in that catalog doesn't go through Tyrus at some point. It doesn't intersect with him. So Tyrus is a key figure in Asian American art history, and like so many of his peers and cohorts, his contribution to American culture and to American visual culture is hugely significant. It's even more important when you think about how he achieved it under really terrible circumstances, right? And of course, today we find ourselves at another sort of precarious time for art and for immigrants and for everything that makes our country great. But the lesson that I've learned from Tyrus by working on this book, and what I hope to share with you, is that there's always joy and community and creativity, and that art always transcends. Thank you.
I was trying to read the book as you were actually talking, so I can say there's some great images in this book.
There's 100 illustrations.
Wow, it's amazing, and we do have copies of the book over there. But before we let people go look at the book and have you sign it, let's take some questions from those here in the.
Oh, and can I also say, whether or not you get the book, I have these little souvenir wristbands. Feel free to take one. So I ended with this sort of optimistic message from Tyrus. It was such a privilege for me to work on Tyrus's story. This little wristband, you know how everyone wears a wristband nowadays, like, live strong or whatever. So it has the book title, but it also has always look up, which was a motto that was really important to Tyrus. And I explained the meaning of the motto in the book, but whether or not you take the book, but please take one of these, because I think it's such an important message that we could all live by.
And lots of colors to choose from, so you can coordinate your outfit with these colors. Do we have any questions here in the club rooms?
Yes, I have a question, Karen. To what extent did Tyrus contribute to the emotional impact of Bambi?
Oh, I mean, animation is such a fascinating art form because somebody has to make it, right? It's not like live action. In live action, you have a script and you move the actors and you have props and you photograph it, right? Everything you see in animation, somebody has to make it first, right? And so like art comes from emotion, art comes from intention, right? And so I think when you get good animation, right, which Bambi is peak beautiful animation, peak storytelling, peak character, development, right? Peak art, right? Like he absolutely is creating the emotion of the film. And Disney Studios at the time was experimenting a lot with color mapping and using color. Like you see this in Fantasia, right? So Fantasia was not, Bambi was supposed to be the second feature after Snow White, but it takes so long that they have to make these other movies come out before it. And so with Fantasia, the studios were like experimenting with color. So like red is going to be like anger and like, violence, and like, blue and purple is like, is calm and stuff like that. And so like, Fantasia doesn't really have a story, right? Fantasia is music and switches of emotion, right? It's also switches in color, right? But we think that Fantasia is like the more stylistic and innovative, but Tyrus is the one in Bambi who's starting at 1938, right? Because, and he, before he's even part of the Bambi project, the way he gets it is he goes to the library, he goes to the public library, gets the novel, he reads it himself, and he thinks like, well, I need to show them what it's supposed to do. And so, one of his original sample images that he does before he's reassigned to the Bambi project, right, is like the fire scene, which is all reds and oranges, and you just see the black silhouette of the stag, right? So you can see that Tyrus is sort of like on his own doing that same sort of color emotion mapping that the studios is always already working on. And so, and then, absolutely his job as the inspiration artist, the concept artist, is he's not creating a single background cell. He's not drawing a single cell, animation cell. He's just making concept images for all of the artists to follow. So he's the first person, right? He's translating the words into story and words into emotion, into feeling, into mood, right? So absolutely, it's hugely important.
Well,
have you given your presentation at the Disney Museum in the Presidio yet?
We're still working on scheduling that.
Okay, good, because I think that would be a great place to give your presentation.
there is a question on Zoom that says, what was the motto on the wristband? So do you want to?
Always look up.
Always look up is the motto on the wristband. Do we have another question here in the room? Because we have another one here on Zoom. I'll ask it. Great. So this question is about the research process for the book. And it says, I understand that Tyrus Wong's archival footprint is far-reaching and dispersed. What were some of the surprising archives, collections, and spaces where you encountered his work that you did not anticipate?
Yeah, this was so much fun, like diving into Tyrus' story, because it's everywhere, right? Because he did so many things and he lived for so long. And, so the first archive, if you're Chinese and came into the US under exclusion, who has that archive? National Archives, right? It's US government and, Customs and Immigration. So, we have the transcript of his interview when he's a 9-year-old or 10-year-old boy, right? When he comes in through Angel Island. So that's one of the first things. And we also have his coaching papers. So like, if you were Chinese and you're trying to come in through Angel Island, you would purchase identity documents, and you would purchase like a whole identity. And so people would spend the time on the sale from China trying to memorize all this information to prepare for that. And so Tyrus, like they would keep their coaching papers, which is all of these details. He kept them to the end of his life, and then he donated them to the Chinese American Museum in Los Angeles. So many multi-generational families in the US, Chinese families, have these coaching documents. So that's one archive. He worked in all these corporations. So Disney, Warner Brothers, Hallmark all have corporation, the corporate archives. The Academy of Motion Pictures, UCLA, Huntington Library, sort of California industry arts focused institutions have things. Stuff is in private collections. He kept everything. I don't know if it's just because he's sentimental or because he was planning for the future. He knew he was planning for posterity. I think if you're an immigrant and you're living in an assumed identity, and especially if you're an artist, you keep things because it reminds you like who you are and who you are at the core, right? And so the family has like tons of stuff, like unbelievable stuff that would like, I had sent stuff to the publisher and then they're like, oh, we just found this, so there was so much stuff. And then so what was the real thing that was surprising to me was everyone thinks that Asian American history is a thing that we don't know about, that it was lost, like that's why the 1995 art exhibit was such a revelation, to go to Ruth Asawa exhibit, everybody thinks we didn't know it before, but it was all already there. You just had to look for it, right? And then to cross-index the archives then becomes really illuminating. So for the WPA records, he had only been with the WPA for a year and a half, and nobody knew why. He had even forgotten why. And so and it turned out that there was a law they changed the law towards the end of 1937 that said that you had to be a citizen. So it had not been the case when the Fine Arts Project had started. And then in 37, they changed the law saying that you had to be a citizen. So he immediately gets cashiered. He's let go. But interestingly, you can go back and look. You can cross-reference the WPA records with other well-known artists, including Mark Rothko, William de Kooning, Arthur Miller. These were all immigrants not yet naturalized at that time who could naturalize. Yeah, and they were allowed to stay in the WPA longer.
And a question here. Could you say something about his immediate family?
Yeah, so actually, somebody was asking about this earlier. So part 1 of the book is all about just the process of getting into the US, right? And so the extraordinary sacrifices that are made by families to get somebody. So Tyrus's father had come to the US first alone. In his late teens, he was married. He didn't have Tyrus. Tyrus didn't exist at the time he first came to the States. And then, as many Chinese did, they were sojourners. They would come here, they would work, and they would save money, and then they would go back. And so Tyrus's father stayed here for about 10 years, goes back, conceives his child with his wife, and then comes back, back to the States, continues working. The wife raises Tyrus, and he has an older sister at this time. And then when Tyrus is about 9 or 10, the father goes back. And then, and at this time, the family makes this decision. So the mother knows that she's going to probably never see her son again, right? Tyrus as a child doesn't really understand, but he's never going to see his mother again, right? And then they come, and then they're separated at Angel Island for a month. So I'm a parent. I can't imagine what it must be like to let go of your child and for the child to endure a month where you don't speak a language, you don't know how long you're gonna have to stay there. You're gonna have to pass this interrogation over information that you've just memorized that's not real, right? But amazingly, he makes it in, and then he and his father reunited. And then his father was an amazing person. We don't know a lot about his dad because that's what happened with these. Once you went into Chinatown, you would just try to lie low. But his father clearly sort of knew that his son was special and he wanted more for him. That's why they had sacrificed so much. So his father would teach. His father was his first art instructor. So most Chinese who came through Angel Island were literate. So in Ellis Island, right, literacy was lower. But if you were to try to come to the U.S., you had to be literate, basically. So they were poor, but he was literate, and his father every night would have Tyrus do practice Chinese calligraphy. And so that was his first, practice with the brush, even before he goes to Otis. And then when Tyrus, as a teenager, wins a scholarship, and then he goes to scholarship on just a summer program, and then he says, I don't want to go back to school. I just want to go to art school. I'm a child of immigrants. My parents today probably would not have, and his dad says okay, and they borrow money and the people who loan him the money are other Chinese in the community who probably they think this is crazy, but they also think that this is an extraordinary opportunity that maybe is not going to happen for anybody else in their community. So Tyrus is. So much it depends on his parents making those sacrifices.
Did he marry kids? Who else is in the family? 'Cause
Yeah.
I know a lot of the items are still with the family.
Yeah. So then Tyrus's wife, Ruth, and Ruth is really important throughout his history. And there's a whole chapter on Ruth's family because Ruth's parents were, Ruth's mother was one of the first girls to graduate from Cameron House. So Ruth's mother, Ruth had grown up to parents who had been very assimilated into white culture. And so her parents were actually pioneers at Bakersfield. So short, after her father had been like a sort of a Presbyterian, he had converted to Presbyterianism and stuff. And the parents eventually moved to Bakersfield, and they're so early in Bakersfield history that they're actually buried in the pioneer section of the cemetery, not in the Chinese section, but in the pioneer section. And so Ruth had grown up in this very assimilated family where they ran a large successful farm. Like her mother was like one of the she was one of the founders of the Chinese church in Bakersfield. She's probably the first Christian Chinese woman in Bakersfield. And then Ruth eventually goes to UCLA and studies English. She had been a Sunday school teacher. And so Ruth is the one who tells Tyrus, they're expecting their baby. She's like, why don't you go work at Disney? And then with the greeting cards, Ruth is the one who, like, using her English major degree, like she's the one who like pulls selections, from the Bible, from British literature, and says like, why don't you use this excerpt? Or like, this is a really interesting passage. Can you draw a picture for this? Like paint a picture for this. This would be a nice idea for a card. And so, this combination of the two of them with Tyrus's sort of unique artistic style and vision, and then Ruth's sort of like social savvy, are absolutely central to their success socially and professionally.
Do they have kids?
They have 3 daughters, and their 3 daughters are all like equally amazing. And they were super involved. Like, I'm very close with them now, and I find them all really inspiring. And they're, they're just, they grew up, they all had the benefit of growing up with these extraordinary parents.
Any other questions here? We'll take one last question if there's one here in the audience, because there's one more on Zoom. Zoom people are up in it today.
Lots of questions. This question says, you mentioned something along the lines of New York being seen as more of a hub for the arts, given its proximity to London and Paris. Can you elaborate on that? Because this listener feels like LA is perceived as like the central location for arts and film and TV. And a lot of book production is still on the East Coast versus here on the West Coast.
Yeah, so we're talking about the first part of the 20th century. So, and we're also talking about the difference between fine and commercial art, right? So at the beginning of the 20th century, right? I mean, America is a new nation, right? I mean, like the center of finance and culture is still on the East Coast, right? Throughout the 19th century, right? Until all of these new art schools sort of bubble up in LA that I mentioned, right? There's a San Francisco like Fine Arts Institute, but there's only a couple up here in the Northern California, and they're all teaching this very traditional European style. But prior to like those ones that are coming up in LA, like those were the only art schools like east of the Rockies, like west of Rockies, west of Chicago even, right? Because New York is one of the oldest cities. It's really New York and Boston, right? Who are like the sort of the cultural centers of America, because they're the ones who have the most history. They're the most proximate to establishment art culture, which is identified with Europe, right? But then you have this important change towards abstraction, towards modernism, towards the West, to Asian aesthetics, to which shifts towards the West Coast that I talked about in this talk. But the other thing that's happening, and I think this is what the Zoom participant is hinting at, is right, as soon as Hollywood develops, is you have a sort of mass culture medium, right, which is going to be far more impactful across the nation than the fine arts, right? Because in the end, wonderful as museums are, and I'm clearly, a devout person of going to museums, right? Not a lot of people go to museums, right? Whereas everybody goes to the movies, right? And so with the rise of Hollywood and with the other forms of print media, right, and sort of mass print media, especially after World War II, when there's this sort of like industrial abundance, right, that there's a sort of a critical weight, or sort of that recenters around mass culture rather than fine art culture. And this is again like why Tyrus's greeting card career is so significant. I mean, his greeting cards are selling in the hundreds of thousands. One of his cards sells 1 million copies. So if you think about it, like, and remember, and these are cards, like his contract says his name has to be shown on the card, that they cannot crop his name out, right? People go and ask, they would go to the great department stores and say like, do you have the latest Tyrus Wong series? I've been waiting all year for it. And I get emails from families all the time who say that, you know, I remember my mom buying it every year and saving it and stuff like that. So, you know, he was very, very admired among contemporary critics for his fine art paintings, but his name was recognized by, you know, because of the greeting cards by people across, you know, across the nation. So I think that's significant, you know, as well.
Which card sold 1 million?
Yeah, it's in there. Yeah.
Because a lot of them are in here. Christmas Kitten is adorable.
Oh, I know.
We're just gonna find that name of that card so I can look at it. Maybe I'll wrap up while you look for it. Please join me in thanking our speaker, Karen Fang. And thank you for coming to this Book Club of California program this evening, whether you're joining us here in person or joining us online on Zoom. You can register for any book club program.
That's the million selling card.
Oh.
And because of the success of this card, like the pink trees becomes this recurring thing. So almost every one of his series, so every series would be like 20 to 25 cards each year. And so for like the next 6 or 7 years, like each series had like pink trees.
Let me just say the name of it for people on. The Shepherd is the name of the card. I don't know if you can see it right there. If you're joining us on Zoom, now you can see it. If you're here and you want to look at the book, it is on page 303 in the book. Karen's going to be over at the table showing the book and signing it if you're interested in getting a copy. If you're on Zoom and you're interested in getting a copy, you can email me. I'm kevin@bccbooks.org. Again, thanks everyone for joining us. You can join any Book Club of California program by registering at bccbooks.org/programs. Again, thanks everyone. We hope to see you again soon and have a great evening.